Hey guys, welcome once again to this explanatory video on a new topic. This time we will discuss passive voice. Now, when we talk about passive voice, we usually talk about a topic that is somehow confusing for some people. I think it depends a lot on your basis on the topic. If you have strong basis on this topic, then I don't think you will have much of a problem. Now, before we start talking about passive voice, I want to clarify certain confusions, certain issues that sometimes people get wrong about passive voice. First, I need to tell you that passive voice is not a tense, okay? So the same tenses that we have in active voice, that is present and past, the grammatical tenses are present and past. Future is not a grammatical tense. If you remember our classes on English Grammar 1, we studied that the future is expressed through a modal, right? The verb per se does not have a form of future. But anyway, coming back to the point, passive voice is not a tense. Okay, so we have a present and past in active and in passive voice. We have the same aspect as well. We have the progressive aspect, the perfective aspects. They are the same. We don't have a different aspect with a passive voice either. What changes in between passive and active voice is the focus of attention. The focus of attention is different when we talk about passive and active voice. See, when we talk about active voice, we focus on the person who does the action, right? That's why we usually start the sentence with a subject. Usually we start the sentence with a subject because we normally tend to pay attention to the beginning of a sentence, right? And that's why we do fronting when we are trying to bring attention to a specific part of the predicate. We front that part of the predicate so that it gains special emphasis on the reader's mind. So that's in the case of the active voice. In passive voice, the focus of attention shifts. We are not paying special emphasis to the person who does the action or to the thing or to the process that carries out an action, but to the recipient of this action, to the object of the sentence, right? So basically those are considerations regarding passive voice that we need to bear in mind. It's not a different tense, right? We have tenses, which are a different aspect to cover. We have already discussed tenses, we have already discussed aspect, we have discussed mood, we have discussed modality, and we have discussed voice very superficially, right? But we have already discussed what voice is as well. We know that we have two voices, right? Active and passive voice. The passive aggressive voice, that doesn't exist. That was just a joke that I told you. Of course that doesn't exist, right? Now, let's discuss the differences between passive and active voice, guys. We'll see that in active voice, the agent, the grammatical agent, is in the subject position. The agent is the person, the person or the subject, right? The person, the thing that causes the action to take place, right? So in the case of active voice, the agent is in the subject position, so that's actually the subject, right? In passive voice, the receiver is in the subject position, so the direct object is going to move to the subject position. And I have a couple examples for you. Check this out. We tried to get help during the storm, but we couldn't get through on the phone, so we waited until the next morning. In this sentence, we are paying attention to who is doing the action, right? We tried, we couldn't, we waited. The focus is on the doer of the action, right? Check out the next sentence. See how it contrasts. The next morning, our roof was damaged and the basement was flooded. Next door, the porch was ruined and several windows were broken. What are we doing now? We are shifting the focus of attention. We are not focusing on the storm anymore. We are focusing on what the storm caused. Our roof was damaged. The basement was flooded. The porch was ruined. Windows were broken, right? So we are shifting the attention from who or what does an action to what the object of this action is. So that's basically the difference between active voice and passive voice. Now, there are certain verbs that we don't use in passive voice because of different reasons, okay? The first reason why we don't use a verb in passive voice is because it's an intransitive verb. An intransitive verb will never be able to be transformed into passive voice, okay? Because an intransitive verb does not take objects, right? It's not possible to have an object after intransitive verbs. After intransitive verbs, we are going to get possibly adverbs, right? But direct objects, object complements, they're not gonna happen, okay? We have certain transitive non-passive verbs. That is to say, they are transitive verbs. They may have an object in active voice, of course, but they are not transformed into passive voice because they sound awkward. What we do with these verbs when we transform them into passive voice, it is a very awkward utterance. We have, for example, have, resemble, etc. Now imagine have. They have a nice house. If I turn that into passive voice, I can say a nice house is had by them. That is really awkward. That is a really awkward utterance. Una casa es tenida por ellos. Not really. Not even in Spanish. We don't do that. It sounds really off, right? So we have intransitive verbs that they don't take objects, so we cannot transform them. We have some transitive verbs that even though they take objects, we don't transform them. There are very few verbs that comply with this second category. And we have the case of intransitive verbs and transitive verbs. What I mean to say is this. Some intransitive verbs, right? Some of these verbs can behave as transitive verbs, okay? So, depending on the meaning of the verb, sometimes they behave as transitive verbs, sometimes they behave as intransitive verbs. For example, check these verbs. They can be intransitive, but they can also behave like transitive verbs. To not go that far, I want to direct your attention to this verb. This verb idiomatically could be considered a transitive verb, okay? But well, the point is, you need to pay attention especially to these verbs, to the intransitive verbs that they cannot have objects, and to these transitive non-passive verbs. This is what we need to pay more attention to. This is better detailed in the lesson. Of course, you can check that out. Intransitive and transitive verbs, well, sometimes they are transitive, sometimes they are intransitive, but what is going to be our focus of attention is whether we have a direct object or not, right? That's the central point. Now, to transform a sentence from active to passive voice, it's actually very easy as long as you remember these specific pointers. I am going to give you 4 pointers that we need to follow in order to make a transformation from active voice into passive voice. The first thing you have to make sure of is that you have a direct object, right? If the sentence has no direct object, of course I am talking about active voice. If the sentence in active voice has no direct object, it is simply impossible to transform that sentence into passive voice, because if you try to transform that into passive voice, you are not going to have a subject for that sentence. Now, sometimes what people do is to create an inversion, and we must not confuse inversions with passive voice. An inversion is when we switch the place of the subject and the direct object, but the meaning remains the same. Sorry, let me rephrase that. We make an inversion of the subject and the predicate, okay? We make an inversion of the subject and the predicate, but that's not passive voice. For example, if I say, in the river lied the man, okay? In the river lay the man. That's a different thing. I'm not changing the verb. I'm just switching the place between the subject and the predicate, okay? So that's the first thing we do. We need to make sure that we have a direct object. Next thing we do is that we move the direct object to the subject position and the subject moves to the predicate position, okay? Sometimes we do not use the subject, and we will talk about this in the next video. Now, next you need to check the tense, the aspect, the modality of the verb, because they need to be maintained. Because we are not changing tenses, we are not changing aspects, we are not changing modalities, we are just changing voice, okay? I'll explain about this in the next video as well. And then we need to bear in mind that we are going to make a transformation. When we are transforming a sentence from active to passive voice, we need to bear in mind that we will always need to use verb to be in passive voice. We will always use verb to be. And we are going to use a principal verb and the auxiliary verb. Verb to be is going to be the auxiliary verb. And the verb that transmits the meaning of the action in active voice is going to remain the principal verb, okay? But in order to do this, we need to make some adjustments that they are not really difficult, but this is the most tricky part, I would say, in passive voice. That there are certain steps that we need to pay close attention to when we are transforming the verb. When we make this transformation, what we need to bear in mind is that the verb to be is going to take the tense, the aspect, and the modality of the principal verb in active voice, and the principal verb is going to be transformed into its own past participial form, okay? I'm gonna explain more about this in the next video because time is almost over for this one, okay? So please hang around for the next video, where we are going to continue talking about how we structure the transformation of the verb in passive voice.